Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Ken. It is my distinct pleasure to be able to moderate and introduce our first panel of speakers. In this first panel, we have a suite of agency representatives from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and the Environmental Protection Agency, Region 5. They will come together to set our stage for the day with presentations on Wisconsin's approach to managing phosphorus, including a description of the interagency relationships and partnerships that exist to do this work, various federal and state regulations that oversee the phosphorus issues on the point and non-point side, as well as a discussion of Wisconsin's voluntary compliance mechanisms. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce all three speakers in the order that they will be presenting, and then we'll kick off in that order. So first we'll have Matt Chowdhury is the Phosphorus Implementation Coordinator with the Water Quality Bureau at the Wisconsin DNR. In this role, Matt coordinates the Wisconsin Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits, the WPDS permits, as they relate to Wisconsin's numeric phosphorus criteria. In prior roles, Matt has worked as a monitoring and research coordinator for a nonprofit watershed group, a fisheries technician for the U.S. Forest Service, and as a GIS specialist for a municipal office. Our second speaker will be Cody Calkins with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, or DATCP, where he focuses on nutrient management policies and standards, prohibitions, and innovations. Cody has almost a decade of experience in soil and water conservation and is currently working to show that through voluntary adoption of nutrient management and other conservation practices, farms in Wisconsin can play a role in significantly helping to reduce and protect the impacts to our natural resources. Lastly, we are pleased to have Steve John with the Environmental Protection Agency, where he's been for 31 years and currently serves as the manager of water permits for, manager of the water permits branch for Region 5. In this role, he works with the water permits branch staff to implement wastewater permit and pretreatment programs, as well as a permit program to protect groundwater. Prior to the EPA, Steve worked in the private sector role, controlling hazardous waste releases into the environment, securing operating licenses for hydroelectric power projects, and evaluating effects of transportation projects on environmental and cultural resources. So today you'll hear about the slew of activities, regulations, and incentive programs that we've used in Wisconsin this past decade to try to address our phosphorus issues. So with that, Matt, please take the microphone.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. They've got my slide queued up. Excellent. So what a turnout. I am very excited to see a full room here for our phosphorus conference. Being DNR's phosphorus coordinator, this has been a huge focus of my work over the past 5 years. However, phosphorus has been a huge focus of the entire agency for the last 10 plus years following our standards. So you're going to get the regulatory context from me as it pertains to wastewater. There's a ton of work being done all the way from monitoring to developing total maximum daily load studies to writing stormwater permits as well. So I'm going to give you an account of what DNR is doing in our most probably acutely affected program, and that is wastewater, and how that relates to some of our agricultural sources as well. As a side note, I was outside all weekend and the cold took its toll on my vocal cords, so hopefully I hold together for you here. Algae. Dense aquatic vegetation, like the whole water column taken up with aquatic vegetation. Muck, stink, conditions that are not inviting by any means. Toxic conditions, beach closures. These are some of the impacts Wisconsin residents experience from nutrient pollution. phosphorus being the driver. We have a rich landscape, rich agricultural production. When that production is displaced, when those nutrients end up in our waterways, we have too much growth there in our waterways. Some phosphorus is important, obviously, for the baseline productivity of an ecosystem. However, at the concentrations we're seeing in a lot of our waterways, the conditions are downright uninviting. So we could have a better connection to our waterways in our state if the kids wanted to go swimming, if folks were more interested in going to the beach. And it's kind of a shame that we are leaving a lot of these benefits unrealized. Now, this isn't every day on Lake Mendota. I don't want to be a sensationalist here. Conditions vary throughout the year. So these are things to be aware of as we move forward regulating phosphorus. The focus, of course, for phosphorus is that it is the limiting nutrient in most cases for growth in our waterways. And there are many sources of phosphorus. So a little water quality 101 for you here, classic sources diagram. We've got towards the bottom of the picture our point sources, discrete conveyances of pollution into waterways. Those are pretty well defined, regulated under permits. As you move towards the upper part of the diagram, you see the more non-point source issues. So these are things where the conveyances aren't as discrete or aren't as defined. It's largely driven by runoff, right? And in a state where almost half of our land is in agriculture, more so in the southern part of the state, that becomes a big influential factor in our water quality. If you think about the source of the water in any river or lake, that came from precipitation. That had to fall on the land before it made it to that waterway. So every drop of water in that river or lake has interacted with the land surface in some degree. What did it interact with? Was it manure-laden, tilled-up soil? Was it a city street conveying it quickly into a stormwater collection basin? Was it a prairie that allowed it to percolate into groundwater first? These are all factors to be aware of when we look at phosphorus holistically. There have been regulations on the books for quite some time that have dealt with quality of water and more specifically negative impacts to water. So the first couple points up there are our narrative standards. They've been on the books for a long time. Discharges shall not result in unsightliness, no scum or other material, things that are very descriptive. But taking those and writing a permit limit based on them is very challenging. There may be challenges, legal challenges to that, right? So that is, while serves as a good solid base, it doesn't get us all that far in regulating phosphorus. There are technology-based limits that some of our larger point sources have adopted, and this occurred back in the 1990s. Dischargers that discharge over 150 pounds a month total phosphorus, if you're a municipality, or 60 pounds a month if you're a industry, you are subject to a 1 milligram per liter technology-based limit. And that means installing a basic treatment process to remove phosphorus from wastewater. And that was a huge step forward. However, it did not address all of the point source discharges. It didn't really get at non-point sources either. And while progress was made, and this was a big deal at the time, in the 90s, you would have thought there was a really heavy hammer coming down with those technology-based limits, but point sources adopted the needed treatment, and things moved on. but not stemming all of our sources of phosphorus to waterways. Throughout the 2000s, public outcry began to mount. And in the late 2000s, environmental groups came together to essentially threaten a federal lawsuit that would override some of DNR's ability to set our own standards, and that had to come through multiple avenues, and eventually DNR adopted numeric standards in 2010, partially as a product of that interaction throughout the 2000s. Now, the scientists were working in the background this whole time. In 2006 and 2008, USGS released 2 papers, and those were the products of years of monitoring at 282 sites around the state to define what are appropriate levels of phosphorus in Wisconsin's waters. And this was done through breakpoint analysis of multiple biotic indices. If you graph nutrient concentrations in stream with a biotic index, what concentration does that biotic index tank? That might be the concentration that you don't want to let your streams fall above. So defining those, we had a lot of good data going into those standards based on those studies. Looking at lakes as well, we relied pretty heavily on Minnesota's research into what levels of phosphorus result in the amount of nuisance algae days on lakes. So that informed standards for our lakes, and we also looked at sport fish communities and pre-settlement sediment conditions as well. So in 2010, these standards were adopted, and you can see they range here for varying water bodies. From very low, 5 micrograms per liter for Lake Superior, up to 100 micrograms per liter for bigger river systems. Those were reflected in changes to administrative code. So NR 102 houses our water quality standards. NR 217 gave us our implementation framework for the phosphorus standards, and also changes to NR 151 runoff management. One of the biggest impacts of these regulations were low-level limits to point source dischargers. Only 200 were unaffected, 200 out of the 750 municipalities and industries, things like paper plants, cheese producers, et cetera. Half of the facilities got a very low phosphorus limit set equal to the criterion. What this means when a facility receives a phosphorus limit that low is that more treatment technology is needed. Oftentimes tertiary filtration. So that's going beyond the existing chemical or biological treatment that can be implemented fairly economically at large scale into a much more intensive process. In 2015, as part of the state's multi-discharger variants for phosphorus, we looked at the economic impacts. And by we, I mean the state, DOA, and some contracted entities. What they found was that if there was a heavy-handed approach to requiring phosphorus compliance right away, we would see some of these pretty astounding economic impacts, including 4,500 jobs lost in the state based on incurring those compliance costs. So regulatory flexibilities were required for point sources. And we did this through trading, through adaptive management. The multi-discharger variance has been extremely successful. And we have individual variances as well. More details on those later. One thing these alternatives have done is set up a ecosystem services marketplace. And this is essentially now equating farm phosphorus to phosphorus discharged from wastewater plants. How much is it worth on a per pound basis? What sort of offsets can we achieve at a lower cost than building a fancy tertiary filter at our wastewater plant? By and large, when you look at agricultural phosphorus, that is the low-hanging fruit. Gains in I should say pollution reductions are much more economical on the phosphorus or on the agricultural side of things, because according to the Wisconsin Nutrient Reduction Strategy, 82% of the phosphorus in our surface waters comes from non-point, whereas only 18% comes from point sources. So in some watersheds, you could completely eliminate the point sources and you would never achieve standards regardless. There are some effluent-dominated areas as well. So largely, success hinges on agriculture for attaining standards. Not to point the finger at agriculture, of course. I mean, they grow our food, and they are a big part of our economy. And lastly, I will just leave it off with TMDL development, I think, is our next phase for regulatory equity for point sources versus non-point sources. We can go through and do a bunch of analyses and basically arrive at, how much phosphorus is coming in from all sources, regulate all sources accordingly. So here's an example of a subbasin near Poinet, where we have found that agricultural fields need to achieve 1.26 pounds per acre per year for this creek, Rowan Creek, to meet standards. As part of the TMDL process, Poinet was also given a waste load allocation, 524 pounds per year. The agricultural fields were given 889 pounds per year. Poinet was able to achieve their load allocation from the TMDL based on installing treatment. We've run the numbers through SNAP Plus and have determined for this basin, using basic conservation practices, the ag fields can achieve 0.90 pounds per acre per year based on those basic agricultural practices. But I don't know what mechanism will push the landowners in that watershed to make those changes to their fields. So a little overtime here. Thanks everyone for sticking it out. Contact information, and I will relinquish control.
Thank you, Matt. In a quick transition between the two, I have a clarifying question I guess I'm interested in you addressing, if you can, Matt. When it comes to the TMDL, what mechanisms exist currently to be able to implement the non-point side of a TMDL, if at all?
So I would say, in general, the mechanisms are lacking. I put out that number, 1.26 pounds per acre per year. The statewide standard right now is 6 pounds per acre per year per NR 151. So I think there's a disconnect between what the TMDL says needs to happen and what we can make happen on the landscape.
Thank you for that. Appreciate the clarification. And now I'll introduce Cody to come up and take the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Like Sarah said, I'm Cody Calkins. I'm a conservation specialist with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection. My background is in soil. I have a bachelor's degree from UW in soil science. I'll be here to talk about some of our programs, policies and partnerships, and things like that. Just a brief introduction to the Bureau of Land and Water. That's where we're housed in the Soil and Watershed section. So the Bureau of Land and Water Resources works with local governments, other state and federal agencies, and landowners to conserve soil, prevent agricultural runoff, and preserve farmland and infrastructure for future generations. The Bureau's programs are far-reaching. By protecting Wisconsin's watersheds, we also protect the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River, and ultimately the Gulf of Mexico. Some of the programs that are housed within our Bureau include conservation engineering staff. We have nutrient management program, which I also am part of. We have the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, livestock siting, farmland preservation, producer-led, and more. Just a general overview of where we're at today. I will cover the Phosphorus Index and SNAP Plus. I'll go over a little bit of our programs, partnerships, and policy. I'll go over a little bit of the soil and water conservation standards that we deal with at DATCP, and I also cover a little bit of nutrient management. Also for reference, I cover conservation compliance for the Farmland Preservation Program, and I also manage the Certified Soil Lab program for the state. Just a little bit on relationships. So at the regulatory level or at the state or county level, we deal with a lot of partnerships in my position. Primarily, we're here to provide technical and financial resources to our county partners, other partners, producers and landowners, as well as other agency staff like UW Extension, Soil Science, and the likes. It would not be possible to implement these programs at a local level if people weren't interested in them and we didn't have funding or, really the appetite locally. Our programs and our kind of philosophy in our section is locally led voluntary conservation is really kind of the way forward for some of in the state for resource protection. Just a general policy overview. So when we're talking about conservation compliance in the state, there are three kind of key players. We have DATCP, we have the DNR, and then we also have our partners like DNR, or NRCS, the counties, and other agencies and partners within DATCP itself. At the overall kind of policy level, DNR sets the agricultural performance standards for the state. Those include soil and water runoff, nutrient management, the phosphorus standard. For instance, NR 151 requires that croplands, pastures, and winter grazing areas, they shall average a phosphorus index of 6 or less over the accounting period or the crop cycle, crop rotation, and may not exceed a phosphorus index of 12 in any individual year within that accounting period. So when we're talking about the agricultural performance standards, DNR is, they're set out by statute in Chapter 92 to implement those and set forth those agricultural performance standards. Here at DATCP, we have a slightly different role in this field. We're non-regulatory, except for those that are voluntarily participating in our programs. The way that we help producers, landowners, and other staff implement those agricultural performance standards is through our administrative code, ATCP 50. And within ATCP 50, if we're talking about the phosphorus index, we don't have a specific phosphorus index requirement within ATCP 50. That falls within our nutrient management planning program. And the way that we, as staff, implement the nutrient management plan requirements in ATCP 50 is through conservation practices that NRCS has put together, like the NRCS 590 standard nutrient management. So ATCP 50 is our soil and water resource management program. Primarily, it is here for soil and water conservation on farms, which sets the criteria for installing conservation practices that are required to be implemented on all farms, like nutrient management, in order to meet specific NR 151 performance standards. As well, we also set the criteria for soil and water professionals, like conservation engineering practitioners, nutrient management planners, and those soil manure testing laboratories. These listed are the soil and water conservation standards in the state. So on the left, you'll see the NR 151 agricultural performance standards and prohibitions. Those include sheet, rill, and wind erosion, tillage setbacks, the phosphorus index, manure storage-related requirements, processed wastewater, all the way down to nutrient management and manure management prohibitions. At DATCP, like I said, in our program, we have farm conservation practices. Those include nonpoint source pollution control, soil erosion control, nutrient management, and tillage setbacks. The phosphorus index, that is one of the agricultural runoff performance standards that need to be met in the state, and like mentioned before, it is required on all croplands and pastures in winter grazing areas. The phosphorus index is calculated by estimating the average runoff phosphorus delivery from each field to the nearest surface water in a given year. It is based on crop management, fertilizer, manure applications, tillage, long-term weather, and soil erosion using the Russell 2. It is reported as a whole number, and the higher the number, it is a likelihood that the field is going to contribute phosphorus to those local water bodies. The way that we help farmers in the state implement the phosphorus index is through nutrient management planning. In Wisconsin, a nutrient management plan is required to meet certain criteria that's set forth in ACAP 50. It applies to all landowners who apply any nutrients to any field, including pastures, with some caveats, those being related to animal numbers on those fields. It is required to be written by a qualified planner. That nutrient management plan is required to be based on soil nutrient tests conducted by a certified lab, and it must comply with NRCS's Conservation Practice Standard 590 and their Wisconsin Technical Note 1. It is also required that that plan not exceed nutrient recommendations based in the UW Extension publication H2009. And here in Wisconsin, the primary way that farmers and landowners are implementing nutrient management is utilizing the SNAP Plus nutrient management software. This software allows for people to make the best use of their on-farm nutrients. It assists them with meeting conservation compliance requirements like soil erosion and the phosphorus index. It allows them to calculate potential soil and phosphorus runoff, and it automatically fills out portions of their nutrient management checklist, which is occasionally required by the counties to be submitted on an annual basis. Version 2 currently is available, and it is an application that you can download to your computer. And in the future, version 3 will be web-based, and it is not yet released. We're currently working with the SNAP Plus team to get that put together. And lastly, I will just cover some of our bureau-level programs. These programs are available to county staff, to producers. First, we have the Soil and Water Resource Management Grant Program that is primarily run through Kim Carlson and Susan Markert. It provides grants to counties for staffing and other conservation practices. We have the Farm Preservation Program, which provides tax incentives to landowners who are compliant with those conservation requirements. We have the Nutrient Management Farmer Education Grants, which provides funding to producers to write their own nutrient management plans, as well as some stipends for soil sampling and instructions on how to write their own nutrient management plans. We also have the Producer-Led Watershed Protection Grants, which the funding is focused on non-point source pollution abatement for those groups. And then we also have conservation engineering, which then also provides more technical resources to conservation staff and producers, more on the farmstead level. And I yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Cody. So as you're seeing from Matt's presentation and now from Cody's, we have somewhat of a carrot and a stick approach that we've been taking in the state related to point sources and non-point sources. Cody, would you have an idea of what program out of the voluntary mechanisms that DATCP has to offer for agricultural producers has yielded the most participation and or gotten the most bang for our state dollar out of cost sharing to incentivize producers to achieve higher levels of conservation?
Yeah, in terms of just acreage, the Farmland Preservation Program requires conservation compliance with all of the conservation provisions, one of those being nutrient management. And the way that we track that is the counties receive those checklists or nutrient management plans on an annual basis typically, and then they report that to DATCP. Currently, we're sitting at about 33% of the state's agricultural land covered by nutrient management plan. The producer-led program is also incredibly popular and has very slightly different mechanisms than the Farmland Preservation Program, but both are very popular, get a lot of interest on an annual basis.
Great, thank you. And lastly, I will invite Steve to come and take the podium, who will cover the perspective from our Region 5 EPA on phosphorus management in Wisconsin and to touch on across the region. So thank you for being here, Steve.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning. We were all asked a few minutes ago what we hope to get out of the conference. And I've already been taking notes, so I know I'm going to get things out of the conference. But I'm here, and EPA is here, not to get, but to give. And it is to give thanks to and offer appreciation for the state of Wisconsin and its residents for the initiative, the creativity, and the dedication demonstrated over the last 12-plus years to tackle the challenging problem of phosphorus pollution. But for the success that we saw and had a little bit of a hand in helping Wisconsin create the system for addressing phosphorus in the state, I probably wouldn't be here. I would have said, no, thank you, I've got other work to do. I'll get going in a second, but if there are any students in the room, my remarks are going to be a little bit of a lesson on federal environmental law, including the relationship between the federal government and the state government in carrying out federal environmental law. So with that, I will proceed. And getting directly to that topic, what we see embedded pretty much throughout all federal environmental laws is a concept some will refer to as cooperative federalism. So Congress writes these laws to say EPA can run various environmental protection and restoration programs, but states can ask to run those programs instead of EPA. That framework, if you will, reflects broad recognition by Congress that states, at least, certainly in the water arena, are principally responsible for protecting the waters within their jurisdictions. So I'm going to go over some details about what that means generally and what it means in terms of the phosphorus rules in the state. And then lastly, I'll just give a very quick overview of what's happening with respect to phosphorus around the Great Lakes and nationally. So let's talk about the Clean Water Act, which has been my exclusive focus for 31 years now. It recognizes, again, that states are in the forefront and should be in the forefront in protecting water within their jurisdictions. It creates a role for US EPA to oversee and partially fund those state programs, and that funding is appropriated by Congress. So thanks to the good graces of Congress, we're all employed. Some of us are employed, including many employees at DNR. So the programs created under the Clean Water Act include programs for monitoring surface water quality and setting standards for surface water quality, establishing lists of waters that do not meet those water quality standards, preparing a so-called budget, if you will, a pollution budget for waters that do not meet standards, and those are called total maximum daily loads. My program, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System program. Moving on, Clean Water Act also creates a program and provides funding for projects to reduce nonpoint sources of pollution. Congress appropriates grants to partially fund state programs, and later I'll share some figures on appropriations funneled through EPA to Wisconsin DNR. It gives US EPA authority to approve or disapprove various actions taken by states. The adoption or the revision of water quality standards, the listing of waters that do not meet standards, the preparation of the total maximum daily loads, and the establishment or the revision of NPDES state programs. Within the NPDES program, US EPA also has authority to object to a particular permit if we find that the permit does not meet the Clean Water Act. And that's a discretionary authority available to EPA. So how does this all shake out in terms of phosphorus in Wisconsin? Well, EPA approved Wisconsin's NPDES program called the WPDS program all the way back in 1974. Around that time, Wisconsin had the narrative water quality criterion that Matt spoke of. Those narrative criteria carry equal weight under the law as numeric criteria. But as Matt indicated, it's a little bit more challenging to put a narrative statement into practice, especially in the form of like a effluent limitation and a permit. And then fast forward to 2010, and Wisconsin did adopt numeric water quality criteria for virtually all surface waters in the state. And they paired it up with a companion rule for describing how the state intended to carry out those criteria in the WPDS program. To both Wisconsin and EPA's credits, the two agencies worked very closely together. So there was a lot of creative thinking going on within DNR, recognizing some of those facts that Matt had shared, that, you know, nonpoint sources are a significant percentage of the phosphorus loading to surface waters in the state, and the cost for point sources to meet effluent limits based exclusively on numeric criteria could be unaffordable for many point sources. So the state, as you might recall, put out a draft rule for phosphorus implementation, and US EPA kind of worked side by side with Wisconsin to assess whether that draft rule met the Clean Water Act or not, and where there may have been points of divergence, we worked together to resolve those. 6 minutes? Okay, excellent. A lot of meetings in person and by phone to kind of bring the two parties together, if you will. And it was very clear, abundantly clear from the outset that both Wisconsin DNR and EPA had a shared goal of getting to yes, for US EPA to get to yes. So the Clean Water Act sets out a couple of tasks for US EPA in this context. On the water quality standards front, the task is to ultimately approve or disapprove the standards. For the NPDES program, there's a screening question of whether the changes proposed for phosphorus leave unchanged or actually change the WPDS program approved in 1974. And if the answer to that question is yes, then US EPA faces the second task of approving or disapproving those changes. So from the water quality standards perspective, EPA considers whether the standards are reasonable and defensible from like a science lens, whether they function to protect the designated uses for surface water, specifically aquatic life protection and recreation, whether they otherwise meet the Clean Water Act. EPA also has to take steps under the Endangered Species Act when we are considering an approval of a water quality standard. And I'll just finish on the standards front, but describing that EPA developed a record on which we were able to base an approval of the phosphorus standards. We answered the screening question on the NPDES front with an answer of yes. And I think there were two main reasons for the answer of yes. One is that the rules specifically embodied water quality trading. So EPA supports trading, and we believe that the Clean Water Act allows it, but Wisconsin came forward to say, we're going to embed it in our law. We're going to embed it specifically in our administrative code. And then also there was the novel and innovative idea of watershed adaptive management. So beyond that, there are many details that need to go into the writing of an NPDES permit, and the state rules address those details, and we had to kind of assess whether all those details lined up with the Clean Water Act, specifically the Code of Federal Regulations. And here you see a very well-worn version of the Code of Federal Regulations. So some examples are, in what factual circumstances are so-called water quality-based effluent limits required? What should be the magnitude of those limits? Over what duration should limits be expressed? Should they apply all year, only part of the year? And does the point source have to meet them immediately, or can time be provided in a permit for the point source to take steps to meet that limit? And to the extent that time is provided, what are the meaningful milestones on the path to actually meeting the limit? And what sort of time lapse should occur in between the milestones? So going back in time, all the way back to 2003, EPA issued a policy statement in support of water quality trading. And for those monitoring kind of current events out of EPA, EPA does plan specific rulemaking to embody water quality trading and other market-based approaches in the NPDES program nationally. And a notice of that action, draft action, should come out in June. I'll mention being one of the frontline reviewers for US EPA on the concept of adaptive management, that the concept did challenge US EPA. There was no precedent within EPA or nationally. And for us, the bottom line is to say, if we approve of the construct of adaptive management, we are saying that it meets the Clean Water Act. And by saying that, we are opening ourselves up to potential litigation by those who might disagree with us. So we were very mindful of an important critical background fact consideration that nutrient pollution, phosphorus pollution, is one of the most widespread and intractable water quality problems in the country. And we were highly drawn to the fact that, unlike in trading where you simply have to offset the mass associated with an effluent limit, the goal of adaptive management is actually to meet the water quality standards in the receiving water body. And the bottom line is it was just too good to say no. And so EPA approved it. Let's see. We did tie up some loose ends with DNR with an addendum to the MOA between us and the state. And we did work together with Wisconsin on two of the key implementing actions involving Madison and Green Bay. So I think I'm at time. Let me see if I can mention one more thing. Let me get to some of the money. Hold on a second. Oh, shoot. Okay. Oh, I just want to mention the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the totality of funding US EPA from Congress provides to the state of Wisconsin. So the infrastructure law reflects a historic investment in water and wastewater. In FY22 alone, Wisconsin received $48 million of incremental funding above and beyond what they have received over the years. And in total, the state of Wisconsin received from Congress $141 million to carry out clean and safe water programs in the state. So I will stop there. Sorry I skipped over some stuff, but I'll certainly be around all day if anybody wants to chat. So, Sarah?
Okay, well, this is now time to open it up to the audience for any questions that you might have of our panel. You've just heard a little bit about how EPA has looked at the national water quality standard development aspects, how they work with Wisconsin's DNR specifically on setting those structures in place in our state, and then the voluntary mechanisms that DATCP uses to incentivize agricultural producers to bring their phosphorus index levels down. So we welcome any questions. You're welcome to come to the podium. In the meantime, as I wait for audience members to come up with your questions, I do have a couple of them in particular I'd like to focus on. Steve, how does Wisconsin, I know you mentioned the sort of progressive nature of us pursuing numeric standards at the time that we did. How would you say that we compare to other Great Lakes or regional states in pursuing numeric standards? Is this something everybody's doing? Are we out on a limb in this? Or are we just one of the first adopters?
I'll answer more broadly than just water quality standards. The state of Minnesota does have numeric standards for almost all of its waters, if not all. But in terms of the totality of the Wisconsin program, it's a clear number one around the Great Lakes from my perspective and EPA's perspective.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Prelwitz from the Green Lake Association. Matt, you had mentioned that there's a disconnect between what we can make happen and what needs to happen. But for many watersheds in Wisconsin that are primarily dominated by agriculture, we really are relying on voluntary participation, acre by acre, farmer by farmer, field by field. But our lakes are changing quickly. And so my question is, what role does technology play as a mitigation tool, a short-term mitigation tool, to quickly achieve those phosphorus reductions that are required before our water resources hit an ecological tipping point? So what is the role of technology? What role does it play to kind of short-term combat non-point source pollution reductions? And if it does play a role, who in the state or the nation is using technology successfully to achieve our water quality criteria as we work on that very long process of voluntary participation in non-point source pollution reductions? Thank you.
Fantastic question. Could you specify what type of technology?
Yeah, sure. I think to be determined, open to suggestion. So alum drip treatment system, sort of using our bridges as points of intercepting phosphorus. I know that there are, we have an experimental capture structure where we're using alcan media to absorb dissolved phosphorus from agricultural retention ponds. So things like that.
I see. So that'd be more of the intensive, let's pull phosphorus out of the system.
Correct.
Right now.
And maybe harvest it and use it elsewhere if we can, but let's start with the first part.
Sure. I would say that a proactive approach is to keep the phosphorus out of the water to begin with, right? So now I don't work with the technology side of things that you're mentioning, but I would say the general stance by the department has been that proactive measures are the typically encouraged policy, keeping the phosphorus on the landscape and not having to do some big in situ removal. However, this happens, and it is a tool that's used, alum drip treatments, for example. And in the right situation, as you mentioned, this may stem some of the acute impacts of phosphorus to surface waters. I don't see it becoming the across-the-board norm.
And do you know of anyone in the state who is successfully using technology or in the nation to achieve those reductions?
There are a number of projects across the state that happen every year. I would have to have somebody from our surface water program come up to give you any specifics on those.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, I see Todd's making his way to the microphone. I will hold off on mine. Hi, welcome.
Matt. Todd Ames, retired from the DNR, but still dabbling in water policy, including serving as chair of the Great Lakes Commission. And maybe this is more of a Steve question, because my guess is, Matt, that you don't work as much with the SRF programs in terms of allocating resources, but I'm curious, a number of us have been talking, I mean, the infrastructure law that Steve mentioned is really a game changer. I mean, we're talking about money, huge sums of new money coming to the states for the next 4 years. It's already been for 1 year, and we've got 4 more. Anywhere from 3 to 6 times the amount of money that has come in for various programs, and there's specific money for PFAS and specific money for lead service lines, but then there's a lot of money coming into these state revolving loan funds, both drinking water and clean water SRFs, that is, there's a lot of flexibility on what can be done with those monies. And so my question is, what are perhaps other states doing? Might Wisconsin be thinking about doing relative to using those SRF dollars creatively to get at some of these polluted runoff issues and challenges that we have out there, whether it's to protect, you could make an argument for using these monies to do source water protection. You could do it to address public or drinking water issues relative to contaminated wells. There's a lot of flexibility that's out there, and I'm just curious about what creative approaches might be being contemplated to use this enormous sum of new money that we've got.
So Todd, I think you're educating me a little bit about some of the flexibilities under the infrastructure law. I'm not equipped to answer that. I can speak, however, to some points of emphasis and some enhanced tools. On the enhanced tools front, I think there is higher prominence being made available to principal forgiveness for communities that face financial challenges. Points of emphasis, and this carries forward across the current administration, is delivering services to historically underserved communities. And as to details about how to do that, there is a line item, and EPA is kind of gearing up to provide direct technical assistance to communities to get them into the pipeline for funding under SRF. Many entities are sophisticated and are well-versed into how to get into line for SRF funding. But there may be communities that are less sophisticated and need a little bit of a helping hand to get them into line and put forward a successful application in the SRF program. So that's a clear point of emphasis at EPA right now, is how to reach those underserved communities. Okay.
No, that was a great federal take, Steve. I've got some Wisconsin-specific info, too. DNR's Clean Water Fund program administers the SRF monies. And yes, they've seen a huge influx from the bipartisan infrastructure law. This is a golden opportunity for our small point sources to get a big chunk of principal forgiveness and come into compliance with phosphorus limits that are in their permits. There are flexibilities, however, beyond just end-of-pipe treatment. So SRF monies have been used for water quality trades, and through DNR's pilot projects program, they have been looking at how can we take this opportunity and develop it into a more acknowledged process where we can use point source compliance dollars for curtailing non-point pollution under a trading scheme. And it's absolutely on the table, something our dischargers can take advantage of. We're also empowering communities, as you mentioned, the folks that need a little help to interface with the system. There are 1 or 2 project positions coming on to DNR to help communities take advantage of the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. So hopefully that'll grease the skids on getting some solutions in place.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi, Daryl Smith, the City of Oconomowoc. I have a question maybe for Matt or others that want to weigh in. As you know, we have an adaptive management program, and I get asked questions by folks in our area about it. So an elected official asked me, may be aware of some of the work done even in Madison area, talking about the phosphorus content of leaves. So the question was asked to me, okay, we know there's a lot of phosphorus coming from the broader landscape, that's been shown, but can we identify how much is from leaves versus the actual agricultural activity on the landscape? And given that there are a lot of tree-lined streams and waterways within our watershed, to what degree have we studied that, the actual source of phosphorus within the landscape, whether it's from the ag land itself or the trees that line the waterway?
There was a study, a leaf study done on urban leaf nutrients from stormwater conveyances specifically. And not having a great working knowledge of that study, I don't want to give too many details, but from where I sit, it did not seem to be a a revolution in phosphorus as far as leaves being a huge significant source that should be curtailed when compared to all the sources in the watershed. So we haven't seen leaf control be a major credit generating activity or a major target for reducing phosphorus pollution. However, in urban areas, it could certainly make up a chunk that should be addressed through leaf management. I know that's big here in the Chain of Lakes.
I don't understand about the leaves. Is it within the organic structure of the leaf itself, or is it because it catches phosphorus from the environment that's toxically deposited on there?
Ooh, I would
I mean, what's
speculate
wrong
the
with
former.
leaves?
I would speculate the former, but I don't have the details for you.
Anyone?
Just like in the leaves.
It's the leaf itself.
Vegetation, I mean,
Okay.
phosphorus, of course, is one of the very key components for plant, productivity, nutrient content. So they hold a lot of phosphorus. So whether it's on an agricultural field or a city street or your yard, those are all phosphorus contribution sources. I wanted to dial in a little bit, backing up to one of the earlier questions on funding. It's been mentioned we have a huge influx, which you'll hear more about later. In some ways, the SRF dollars that were mentioned through the infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act are those all new dollars coming to our state, granted. But to date, prior to any of those large sums coming to us, how do wastewater treatment plants cover the cost of these relatively expensive, oftentimes, upgrades to their facilities?
Well, I think, back in the 70s, there was also a huge influx of federal monies, and that set up a lot of our communities with wastewater treatment, and they've been more or less maintaining status quo from there. Upgrades are required along the way. I would say one of the most basic sources of funding would be, sewer user rates and ratepayer, potentially ratepayer increases, right? So that's where those costs of compliance are transferred through to citizens, and you can see economic impacts through that.
And just as a point of clarification then, how does the non-point source contributors or our agricultural operators in those settings, how do they have to internalize, or how do they cover the cost of whatever practices or upgrades that they would need to establish or generate on farm?
So you're talking more like conservation practice funding, or?
Yeah, is there a mechanism that farmers can use that to either pass those dollars on to someone else, or is that internalized at the farm gate?
I guess it really depends on the farm and who is utilizing what programs. Locally, there's funding through counties for different conservation practices like cover crops, or nutrient management is a large sum of money goes towards nutrient management and cover crops currently. Other practices would be more engineering kind of practices on the farmstead, or but those would be more specific to that section of our agency.
But farmers themselves are not able to push the cost onto whoever's the recipient to the dairy processor, or whoever's taking their milk or their.
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, Matt Hudson with the Burke Center at Northland College in Ashland. So I'm curious, Matt, you provided that TMDL example where there's a large gap between what the phosphorus index, what's stated in the administrative code, and what the TMDL was calling for. And I'm just curious, across statewide at all the TMDLs that we have dealing with phosphorus, if that's pretty common what you're seeing, that large gap between what the index is, what the law is saying, and what the TMDL is calling for, and is this really a key issue here?
Yeah, that is a very common occurrence across all of our TMDLs that look at the equation on a very site-specific basis. We looked at Little Rowan Creek east of Poinette. You can go through all of our TMDLs that cover about half the state, and that same equation more or less holds true, where we're putting a hefty reduction on all sources. The point sources, have to bring their effluent phosphorus way down, 60% in our scenario here. Farm fields, likewise. So, If you're at a PI of 10, maybe it's a PI of 4 or lower. That's very common. 4 pounds per acre per year or lower. That's what the TMDL would say would meet water quality standards.
Well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut off questions there. We are at time, so I apologize for the two of you who won't be able to, but the panelists will be around for the remainder of the day, so please feel free to grab them as you can. As we head into our first 15-minute break, we wanted to ask that you please scan that Slido QR code that it's at your tables, or enter Slido with the link and code #PConference 2023, and provide a few key takeaways from this first panel session. We'll be using these throughout the day. And then you'll hear more as the panels go on about case studies around adaptive management and phosphorus trading from multiple perspectives in those equations. So thank you, and we'll move into our break. Appreciate it.